ListenLayer makes it easy to enhance the quality of your web analytics and data collection by easily filtering out things such as test conversions. Today, I'm going to show you how easy this is to do inside of ListenLayer. Now, if you're new to ListenLayer, make sure that you've properly defined your domain name here and that you've placed the script across all pages on your website using a tool like Google Tag Manager. And then jump to the listeners screen and turn on listeners for applications that you use and user activity that you are interested in. Today, we're going to be using the HubSpot Forms listener to illustrate how to remove test form submissions from your conversion tracking. You can apply the same setup to other form listeners. Simply follow these instructions, but use the listener of your choice. So once a listener is enabled, you'll want to navigate to the features screen, and you'll find one or more filters that are labeled as activity filters. These are the particular features in this listener that push data into the data layer when certain activities occur on the website. For example, you can see here when a HubSpot form loads, the event HS form loaded will automatically be pushed into the data layer along with details from the form itself. And you'll want to make sure that you have probably a couple of these activity features turned on. And then you'll want to publish your changes. And that will effectively enable the listener and allow it to start collecting information from your website so you can write rules inside of ListenLayer. Now, it's important to note also that under event settings, all of the available events that this listener can push into the data layer are shown here. And the two that correspond to the features we have turned on are currently enabled. Lastly, as a listener sees activity on the website, it will begin to collect automatically variables and information from that activity. And then it'll display that on this screen. So when you first enable a listener, this screen is going to appear empty. But once you turn on those features and publish your changes, and then test your website or let it run for a little while, you'll begin to see actual variable information populate in this table. And this is going to be important because when a user submits a form, ListenLayer will automatically collect information about the fields that existed on that form submission. And you'll be able to start to see those populate as variables in this table. And in order to filter out test submissions, we're going to ask our testers, our dev team, or our users to always put a specific keyword or phrase into one or more of these fields when they submit a form. And in doing that, with ListenLayer, we'll be able to look for that value on that field and label the submission as a test submission, and then we can filter that out of our analytics. So let's jump to our test website now that we have our features turned on and we've published our changes. And let's take a look at what happens when we submit an actual HubSpot form. So on this page, we see that we have multiple HubSpot forms that have loaded. And if I jump back to my Google Tag Manager debug, there are 4 events, one for each of those forms. And these events are called HS form loaded. So the form load feature inside of the listener is automatically pushing this information to the data layer, and it includes the structure of the form itself. So you can see this email field, which has some sub elements in here. ID, label, name, and type. And let's go ahead and fill out a form. So we'll fill out this top form. And let's assume we ask our users, hey, if you are submitting a test form, please make sure that you just put the word test into the email field. And of course, you can use a different value if you'd want, or a different field. I would recommend trying to use a field or combination of fields that's going to exist across all of your forms, across the entire website, so you can write a single rule to easily filter out test form submissions from your conversion tracking, for example. So I'm going to go ahead and submit this form, and you can see I was not redirected anywhere, but the listener automatically identified that the form submission occurred and pushed data into the data layer. And it now includes a value inside of the email field. And so this is the individual field that we want to focus on when it comes to actually identifying that this is a test submission. And what we're going to do is we're going to write values, which we've already done, and I'll show you how this works, to push some information into this section of our data layer called form custom values. So notice back up here, these are our form automatic values. The listener automatically collects these from the page. Whereas these custom values are values that we create, well, they're variables that we create, and then values that we push into those variables based on rules. And so you can see tangibly already here what we are going to be doing. We're going to be configuring a custom variable inside of our data layer called form quality. And we're going to call that a test submission. And I'll show you how this is being done currently. And then we will look at doing a simplified approach to define an additional variable. So let's jump back to listen layer. And now in order to push custom values into your data layer, you're going to want to jump to the customization and storage filter inside the feature screen and enable custom data layer values. This is the feature that then allows you to write rules to push values into the data layer. And so what you'll see is when you turn this on, a new menu item called custom values appears. But you'll want to jump to your custom data layers screen here and define the variables that you're going to want to push values into. Those variables exist at the global level and then are available across all of your listeners. So here we already have a variable that we've defined called form quality. If you have nothing here, maybe go ahead and put form quality in and save. And then that'll allow us to jump back to custom values. And you can see we already have a rule set. We have 2 rule sets on this screen, and we can create more rule sets. And this is probably the most powerful feature of Listen Layer, is the ability to write really advanced rules, multiple rules, and use them to push information into the data layer based on user activity or characteristics or pieces of information that the listener picks up from your website. Now, it's important to note, if you have multiple rules, you can drag and drop them. And for every custom variable that exists, all of these rules are read from top to bottom. So this rule set will apply before this rule set. And if a match is found, it will stop looking. And so you always want your more detailed rules at the top. Now, these are both lookup rules. When you create a new rule, you can select a lookup rule or a simple rule. I'm going to first show you the existing lookup rule, and then we'll go through the process of writing a simple rule to define an additional value. So let's jump into form quality. And you can see a little bit more of an advanced rule set here. This table has a left side and a right side. On the left side, we have our conditions. If these 2 elements match, then we're going to return these values into this variable. And those elements we're looking at are, we want a specific event to occur, which is that the form is submitted, and we want the user's email address to include a specific value. And again, as with the overall rule order, the order of these rows matters. The table will be read top to bottom, and once a value is found for a variable, it will stop looking. It will not continue to look down the table. Now, we have another use case scenario where we look at measuring the quality of form submissions. And if you would like to look at more detail about how we set up this specific table, you can dig into that use case. But at a high level, what you can see here is that if our email field contains the word test, we're going to simply label this as a test submission, and we're going to push that into a variable called form quality. And this has already been saved. It's been published, and you can see here that that is why this test submission value appears. So since that's already configured, let's walk through a more simple use case where we might just want to put maybe a 1 into a field in the data layer when we think a form submission is a test. So we're going to jump back here and we're going to create an additional variable. And we're going to call this a test conversion. We're going to make it generic, and that way, if we have a chat tool, for example, perhaps we can also identify the word test in maybe the introductory form submission or one of the messages from the user, and we could label it as a test conversion. This global variable will be available inside of a chat tool to do that. For example, if you're using live chat, you can write a simple rule that will do something very similar to this and push a value into the data layer for that variable. So now that we have our global variable, we're going to jump to custom values and we're going to create a new rule, and we're going to go to a simple rule. And we're going to call this label test conversions. Now, I recommend putting in some good documentation, because when you come back to these rules later, it's nice to have a little summary of what it is. But I oftentimes go back and define those after I create them. And so what we're going to look for is we want our form to be submitted, because we know that at that point in time, we're going to capture some details inside of that form field. So we're going to set that as true. And we also want a specific variable to exist. Now, this variable that we want to exist is the value element of this email field. And how this works is that it's a simple parent-child path. So you can see we have at the top level form automatic values, and then brackets. And inside of that, we have form field values, and then another bracket, and then we have email, and then another bracket. And then you can get down here to the value field, the label, name, and type, and those other things. So we're going to follow this simple path, and we're going to define that path. We're going to use that path to actually get the value of this variable. And so jumping back to listen layer, before you write your rule, it's good to check out your variable settings and make sure you know what variable you're going to be using in your rule, so that you don't have to necessarily navigate away. But I already know that I'm looking for something that has email.value. And previous to this, I've already renamed this variable as user email to make it easier to find. And I will show you how to do that in a second once we save this rule. So what we want is this user email to contain the word test. So now if a form is submitted and the user email field exists with the word test inside of it, we want to do something. We're going to simply label this as a test conversion. So I might just put a 1 here. Now, if you want to get real fancy, you could put a pipe and you could actually insert some other information from your data layer if you are, for example, storing this value directly in a tool like Google Analytics. But in this case, we're going to keep it simple, and we're going to label this with a 1. And now that that's done, I'm going to jump to my variable settings and show you how I was able to more easily find that email field. So when you're writing rules, it's important to know what fields you want to target or focus on. And then come into the screen and make sure you can find them. Make sure that they exist already inside of Listen Layer, which means that the listener has seen them. And you can drill into here and find the actual field itself. So in this case, the field that we want is the actual value that's put into the email field. And what I've done previous to this is I've actually given this a friendly name. This allows me to more easily identify this field when I'm searching for it inside of Listen Layer. Once you save that name, this will be the name of the field in listen layer, but it does not change the value in the data layer. It's simply for the interface. Let me illustrate why this can be very important. So I'm jumping back into my rule. And let's say instead of the email value, we want to define email label. Well, notice how long and complicated these fields are. And notice that this is a value on a field, whereas this is a validation error, which comes from a different element, a different feature in our listener. So when you're looking through this drop-down list and you have maybe hundreds and hundreds of form fields or variables from your data layer that you're looking at, it can be a little bit confusing. And it's easier to just go ahead and go to your variable screen first, maybe rename the variable so it's easier to find that you're looking for, and then you can proceed to write your rules. So we're going to publish our changes, and we're going to say this is called test conversions. And I oftentimes like to just do a hard refresh just to make sure I'm getting the latest version of things. And I'll also sometimes do a refresh on my Google Tag Manager preview. Let's hope it connects. The GTM debugger has been a little bit buggy this morning and had issues connecting. So if it connects, okay, it looks like it works fine. Worked fine. Sometimes that freezes on you and you have to kind of clear it out and start over. So here now we're going to jump back to our Gravity or our HubSpot forms. We're going to submit the same form and we're going to see if our data layer has this new value. And this new value is going to be that test conversion value. And you can see, yes, we have test conversion is equal to 1. So now we've successfully written a rule that across our entire website globally will identify test conversions. And that way, if somebody just wants to test out a form, you can easily exclude this from, for example, your Google Analytics tracking or any of your other conversion tracking. And so let's take a look at how we would actually do that inside of Google Tag Manager. So before we actually dive into the GTM interface, it's important to note that what I'm looking at right here is the push into the data layer that the listen layer listener makes. This data is the structured information that we grab from the activity on your website and we push it into the data layer. Google Tag Manager then reads that information and they make it available for you to easily see and kind of debug here. So this is Google Tag Manager's interpretation essentially of what you just pushed into the data layer, as well as the current state of the data layer. So the data layer for Google Tag Manager is kind of a cumulative thing where you can continue to add and change values, but pre-existing values will still exist if they're not overwritten. Now, just because Google Tag Manager can read this and see it doesn't mean that it's available in GTM for you to do something with. You have to actually create variables, triggers, and tags in GTM so that those things can be targeted. And so here's a list of our existing variables, and we have no variable in here for test conversion, which means that while we can see the test conversion here, we know that Google Tag Manager is reading it and they're understanding that it exists, but it's not available for us to do anything with. And so we're going to go into Google Tag Manager and we're going to create a variable. And whenever you're getting a variable from the data layer, it literally is just a data layer variable type. So you're going to select that. And the name of the variable is that path that we were talking about. So let me show you a quick shortcut for how to easily get to that path. In the console, Listen Layer will write all of the data layer events and information so that you can kind of more easily debug and see it. And if we drill into this event called HS form submitted, we'll see that we can find our test conversion variable and right click on that and select copy property path. And what this will do is it'll give us the path to that actual variable. And this can be a little bit confusing, but it's quite simple. The path is no different than a path in a URL structure, which I'm sure you're familiar with. This is the parent of this, and they're separated with a // Well, this is the same method, except with instead of using forward slashes, we have periods. And so test conversion is embedded inside of form custom values. And believe it or not, when you actually drill in and look at this, you can see that that form custom values is at the top level. There is no parent to that. Although it kind of looks like the event is a parent node, it's not actually. So you can always just copy the property path there to get a quick look at what the reference is to that variable and to make sure that you don't have any errors in typing it out. So we're going to create this variable. We're going to save it. And now if I were to refresh my preview, that variable is going to appear in this list of variables, and it will have a value in it once the value is available. So at this event, we would see that value. But before we do that, we are going to create a quick test tag. And we may actually already have a test tag configured. Actually, it looks like I need to jump to tags here. And we do have a test tag. So we're going to change this test tag to be focused on all HubSpot forms. So we already have a trigger for HubSpot forms submitted. And what we want to do, assume this is a conversion tag, like a Google Ads tag, or maybe a Google Analytics event tag, GA4 event tag. And we want it to fire every time a HubSpot form is submitted. So this is a trigger that we have already created. It's called a custom event trigger, which means it's looking for an event that's going to be occurring in the data layer. And we just target the event name. You can see that event name is here. So every time a form is submitted, we want this trigger to occur, and we might have some tags that reference that. So in this case, we're going to have a test tag that's going to reference that. But we kind of want to have an exception to this, right? We don't actually want it to fire if it is a test form submission. So we have to kind of think about how we're going to write an exception trigger. So we're going to create a new trigger, and we're going to call this a test form conversion. And this is going to be a custom event. It's going to target that same custom event that we were looking at here. And in this case, we want this trigger to occur only if our variable that we just created, that test conversion, contains the value of 1. And now this is going to become our exception. And so in some situations, this should fire, and in other situations, it should not fire. And we could apply this exception to all of the tags that we would be sending conversion data to our platforms for. So for example, if you wanted to do the same thing for your chat tool, you would just have an additional exception that applies to the chat event where you can identify that it is a test chat. And when you're identifying that it's a test chat in listen layer, you would be, again, you'd be pushing a similar value into this test conversion variable. So we're going to go ahead and save this and then refresh our preview. And that just ensures that we're using the latest version of our workspace in our testing. And again, let's make sure that we are fully connected. And what we're going to do is we're going to test a form submission with the word test. Actually, we'll do the one without the word test first, since we already know that the test one exists. So I'm going to put in a real email here. And if we got our latest version of our changes, what we should see is that our test tag is now firing because our event occurred. But let's go ahead and refresh our page, and we're going to fill this out now with a test submission. And in this situation, we're going to see again, we have the same event occur, but our test tag no longer fires. And that's because if we drill into this, well, if we find the test tag down here, we can see why it didn't fire specifically. And you could see that it was blocked by this trigger where the test conversion contains one. And so if you already have all of your conversion tracking set up and you want to start filtering out test conversion so you can have a little bit more accurate conversion data, you maybe want to take a step back and kind of architect a global variable like this that you can push a value into, such as 1, across different activities. And you can use Listen Layer for this. You can use it, you can do live chat, you can do HubSpot forms. We even have a listener where you can identify users' URL parameters as they interact with your website. And so you could just filter out an entire session, just ask your users, hey, throw test equals 1 as a parameter inside of your URL string. And if you're using this listener, you can grab onto that parameter as a variable in the data layer, and you can write a similar rule. So this is just a simple way you can enhance and clean up your data and analytics across your website